Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with the illustrious Tony Magistrale. I am very excited to be joined. I know last time I didn't mention that you were my former professor at University of Vermont. So yes, that's how we are connected. And it's great to have you back on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. A little hot here, but still.
I know we were talking before that I'm lucky actually in Los Angeles and you're in Vermont that I get the cooler temperature here, but you get fall. So and winter. So
yeah, well, I predict that very soon Vermont will be Virginia. And Virginia will be Florida, and then Florida
won't even exist anymore. Yeah. Florida will be gone pretty much.
Yeah, Florida will be gone.
That'll be your next book. The top you'll do a climate change, and that actually would be interesting. Maybe like a climate change in Stephen King or in the.
Well, he's close to this already. I've been doing a lot of writing, Stand and pandemics.
Yeah, the way that he approaches these like post-apocalyptic world. But we're not here today to talk about Stephen King, though he may float in and out of our conversation naturally. Today we are here to talk about your new book, The Great Illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe, which is a really wonderful book that I had the opportunity to read a couple of weeks ago. I personally, I'm familiar with the Edgar Allan Poe canon, but the illustrations and the artists that you mentioned, I learned so much. Like I learned so much every time I read your books, but this one in particular was really just
great.
I'm very excited. So I want to talk a little bit about before we see into the actual illustrations. I know that you have some visuals to show us the concept sort of how this came to be and how you decided to start with looking at the illustrators of Poe versus, exploring Poe's text itself. And then the way you sort of approached this larger philosophical question, I guess, that sort of permeates the entire book of sort of, how does illustration become viewed out of context, or can it ever be viewed out of context? And how we as a society sort of perceive the nature of illustration and sort of how it's been regarded as, almost like second-rate art or low art in the past. So if you want to just give a little bit of a background about how you found the illustrations of Edgar Allan Poe and how you sort of decided to seek into that form of art.
Well, one of the things that's probably most interesting in studying the history of Poe's reputation and his importance in terms of his place in global culture is to talk about what happens after Poe dies.
Right.
Poe dies in 1849, and he dies with a very small, minor reputation. He's known on the East Coast of America primarily because of his editing. Poe edited several of the journals that he published in, especially during the 1840s, the last decade of his life. And that was always his major goal, was to finally become an editor.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Of one of the great journals that there were over 400 periodicals that were being published up and down the East Coast during Poe's lifetime. It was, the 19th century version of Netflix. It's where you went when you wanted to see the writing that was contemporary, that was coming out at the very moment. And almost everything Poe wrote, with the possible exception of Eureka, ended up in these periodicals. And after Poe died in 1849, I think he would have probably slipped into obscurity, maybe became a footnote, particularly for the nasty things he had to say about Longfellow, because he and Longfellow had a raging war in the early 40s against each other, accusing each other of plagiarism and sloppy poetics. But for the French,
right?
Edgar Allan Poe became famous because the French discovered him. And it was largely due to the most important French poet who ever lived, Charles Baudelaire, who literally spent, he was a great poet himself, wrote a collection called Fleurs de Mal, Flowers of Evil. But he also found in Poe a brother. And he spent 20 years of his life translating Poe's short stories into French. This was in the 1860s. Somewhere around the 1870s, Baudelaire's influence also affected the milieu of symbolist France, so that other great poets like Baudelaire and Mallarmé also discovered Poe. Mallarmé was particularly important in terms of the poetry because Mallarmé was good friends with Edward Manet.
Right. He was our first illustrator that we speak about in your book. Yes.
I know I'm throwing a lot of M's at you here. Okay. I hope your audience can bear with me for a minute. If you want, we can go to the slideshow.
Yeah. Let's pull those up.
You're
host now, so you should be able to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think there was an anecdote that you mentioned only 6 books published during Poe's lifetime included illustrations, right?
Right.
Which is crazy.
Poe was interested in illustrations, but he was very demanding, just like he was very demanding in terms of,
Is that a shocker, really?
Yeah. I mean, this is how he was as a critic too. Don't forget that, Rach, that Edgar Allan Poe, because of his connection with all these journals during his lifetime, was also a reviewer. Wrote over 250 reviews of contemporary literature during his lifetime. I mean, how he had time to get drunk is beyond me.
I mean, the fact that I think too, I always say, what makes a really good writer is a really good reader. And I think that the fact that he was so tuned in to what everyone else was doing too, he was sort of able to pick out those elements that he knew appealed to the masses, but then he had his own, masterful spin on it, and how he was able to get drunk. He was just, functioning alcoholic, more or less, I think, right?
Sure. No, that's a really good point, I think, Rach. And I think you also have to keep in mind, too, that Poe was, because he was so highly tuned in to what was being published and what was selling, that a lot of his work was being influenced, I think, by, like, for example, the German shocker tale that was coming across from the ocean. And he was aware of that. He was aware of other writers that came before him. I mean, God knows he was seeped in the Gothic tradition.
Right, exactly.
And, really became, I would say, probably the first major romantic / Gothic generation of American literature. And went on to influence lots of other people, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yes, we'll get there. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the first illustration that was done of Poe's work. This is at least let's call it the first famous illustration. There were several illustrations that appeared during Poe's lifetime, but not a lot. And when Mallarmé translated Poe's poetry, he was good friends with Manet, the very famous post-impressionist Manet, who agreed to illustrate The Raven because Mallarmé found that to be the most important of all of Poe's.
Do you think that objectively, I guess, is that what's considered his most famous work?
I would say if you trace it from Mallarmé's French translation all the way to the present time, without a doubt, The Raven has become his most famous poem.
Yeah, I literally have a blanket that has the entire poem of it on it. So it's come into our households literally.
Yeah. And this was true not only for French, but also other cultures too,
right?
That gravitated towards The Raven as the most important of Poe's work. But there were plenty of other illustrations as the century went on of other Poe poems in addition to The Raven. But The Raven had a special place, no question, and still does.
Right.
And especially if we're talking in terms of the history of illustration.
Right, because this was the first French one, right?
Ever? This was Manet.
Yep.
This is you can see the narrator sitting at his desk.
And this was a panel drawing originally, right? Or a panel illustration.
It's a black and white pen and ink.
It's really so. I mean, it's kind of. I think it could still be done today. Honestly, I think it's almost like it's timeless.
Well, I've read this poem a lot. I've taught this poem a lot, and I've always been fond of it. But when I was looking at these illustrations, and this is over a period of years now, I began to realize that what was going on here was Manet was not simply trying to capture the essence of Poe, but he was also trying to capture the essence of Manet.
Right.
And if I could draw your attention over here to this bowler hat and cane that's located here.
They're like I wouldn't have even noticed those. Your eye, they're very hard to, they're hidden. They're in the background.
They're in the background, but it's going to prove to be very important. Now, if you remember Poe's poem, there's no sense of place in Poe.
It could take place anywhere.
It could take place in your bedroom, Rach.
Or in hell, as another illustrator sort of interpreted.
with all those bare trees behind you.
I know, and my cool, but yeah, it could. There's probably a little raven. There's a bird up there. Maybe that's a raven. Who knows?
But Manet, who was a very cosmopolitan dandy, this was not a poor painter. This was a painter who came from money. And what Manet was interested in more than anything in the 1870s was capturing the urban world of the flaneur. Now, do you know what I mean when I use the word flaneur?
Is it sort of like the bourgeoisie, but like a newer sort of bourgeoisie?
Yeah, it's kind of like
yuppies almost, like
the flaneur was very solidly middle class, but he had lots of leisure,
like the gentrifiers, almost the people. Yeah, there we go.
Lots of leisure time, and also at the same time, lots of disposable income.
Right. So
and
the arts
became this highly cultured, very dandified figure that roamed the streets of Paris in the 1870s.
Like the Moulin Rouge, the Ewan McGregor character, Christian. Yes,
exactly. So what Manet was trying to do in so many of his paintings was to capture that sense of the street life in urban Paris. And he was really one of the great painters of the urban world, and especially the emerging urban world, the bourgeoisie. And what I think is happening here, and this is what I think this is the most important part of what I've had to say, I think, about the Manet illustrations, is that he turned the narrator of Poe's poetry into a flaneur. And I'll continue this by showing you again, this is the second drawing that Manet did of the raven. This is, of course, with the bird tapping on his window.
Yep.
And the narrator gets up, opens the window, and lets the bird in, which, of course, is, you can see this is his beak right here. But what's also important is what's going on behind it.
Yeah, the city, which has never been explicitly stated in the poem.
Exactly. So we've got this dandified gentleman who's wearing his cravat.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it looks like he's wearing some sort of fancy overcoat thing
at midnight. And here he's surrounded he's very clearly in the center of an urbanscape, so that the bird comes in almost as part of the city.
Right, because he has this small balcony as like sort of a division, but it's very easy to pass over that. It's not very separated.
Exactly. So what this reveals, what I think is important about this, is that in this first edition of the great illustration of Edgar Allan Poe's Raven, you begin to see a tendency that runs through all the great illustrators of Poe. And that is that they take from Poe what they find most interesting and then bring it to their world. So that when you're in the 1870s, where Manet was doing, I think this is 1875, when Manet was doing this, Manet was very much aware of the urbanscape that was surrounding him. So what he did was take Poe, or take the poem, and place it into that context. And this is true for almost all the great illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe. This is one of my great discoveries in writing this book, was that you can't separate the worldview of the artist from what they brought to the worldview of Edgar Allan Poe.
Right. And then, it gets to a point, I think, that we'll talk about in a little bit, where then not only are they building off of Edgar Allan Poe for their own worldview, but then the later illustrators are building off of the other illustrators' worldviews as well. So it becomes this multi-layered thing, which is even cooler.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You get this, that's a good way of saying it too, because we are talking about, after all, visual arts. So that the sense of a multi-layered history of illustrators corresponds, especially as we start to move into the 20th century, where color will occupy a dramatic place. Up until the 20th century, almost all the illustration work that's done on Poe is in black and white.
Mm.
So it's almost as if the 20th century discovers not just color, but also the way in which Poe is enhanced by color.
Right. It's like, taking something that was black and white and then adding the color to the existing photo. It's, it's the template is still there, but it adds so much more.
And two, the selection of Poe work that gets popular in the 20th century.
Right.
As we make our way into modernism, we begin to realize that,
which I love. I mean, I think I've seen, you think of Edgar Allan Poe illustrations sort of as more of these romantic, classical, these sort of fit with your mind. And then the modern ones, some of them I was like, this is, and I really, I'm very ignorant in terms of art history and in terms of visual arts. So I was, impressed learning anything. And then the modernism, especially, which I know we'll get to, was like, wow, like really just so emblematic of the time. And also so, really it's so cool how illustrations are such a cultural touchstone too. You can look at films and books, but we often forget too that the illustrations are just as important too.
And to come back to that earlier point I made to you a few minutes ago, that modernism finds in Poe aspects that connect to what makes modernism.
Exactly.
They discover the horror stories in Poe. The Usher,
the cast Amontadillo. I can't never say it. Is it Amontadillo? Is that how you say it?
The Cask of Amontillado.
Amontillado. There we go.
And all the great the horror chestnuts. They start to get illustrated as we turn the corner into the 20th century. Okay, so let's keep going.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, so here's Manet again. Now this is not Poe.
So when did this come out?
Oh, I would probably guess this is probably late 1860s, early 1870s.
So he did use color in other instances. He just didn't for his Poe illustration.
But what I really want to capture here is that sense of the dandified world that Manet was interested in capturing. You see the worldview that he was interested in.
Yeah, it's a casual park outing, but there's a lot of people too.
A lot of people, music in the Tuileries. That's what the name of this is. And it's all about the social world that Manet was most interested in. This is a very typical painting by Manet. And after writing this book, Manet has become my favorite French impressionist, because I now realize what he was doing was capturing that sense of the social life far better than any of his contemporaries, except maybe Degas.
I mean, yeah, he's almost like a social psychologist. It's like, it's not just, the artist and, again, the multi-layered aspect too of his history and his background and what he was trying to accomplish through his painting, so much more than, oh, that's a pretty basket of fruit I'm going to paint.
No.
Yeah.
So, again, keep in mind here's our hats and our cravats. And
I love the blue, the pops of blue there.
And the blue, everyone's dressed like Parisian fashion plates. And so too was his version, finally, of the Raven. Now we're back to the third plate, This is the raven up here, perched on the bust of Pallas, with the narrator looking up at the raven. And again, you remember in the poem, as you work your way through the poem, the narrator becomes more and more flustered by the raven's refusal to answer, "Where's Lenore?"
But he's lying down here too, like in a chaise almost. Yeah, so he's
that way, doesn't it?
Yeah,
that's right.
Not just sitting or standing, but he's literally like reclining.
And here's the last print from it. We can see the outline of the raven here, and perhaps the outline of the narrator, but it's almost as if what we've got here is the raven and the character have disappeared. It's become almost just a hint. You can see why he would be part of what the symbolists would be interested in talking about in terms of what painting and what poetry is supposed to do, rather than to define, but just to hint.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so you can interpret this in so many different ways.
Yeah. So this is where Manet is in the 1870s. And then a decade later, we get another famous French illustrator by the name of Gustave Dior, D-O-R-E.
Oh, it's pronounced Dior.
Dior. And Doré, or some people pronounce it.
Yeah, Dior. I thought it was Doré, but
it depends. I think it's an accent grave on the E, so it's probably Doré. But here's the raven again.
And he brings us into a more sort of like gothic vampire, especially the vampiric element, because I know the raven, you sort of get the entering in, and then the sort of, there's a lot of vampiric elements, and we're not analyzing the raven poem here, but yeah, he also just brings that sort of ominous feeling, I think, too, that was not Manet's illustrations are, there's always a little bit of ominous sense, but mystery almost. It doesn't have to be so much ominous. I think this is where we start to get that sort of more ominous feeling, and the darkness that was not so much present in Manet's.
I think that's probably fair to say. I mean, it's clear Doré was more interested in the romantic elements of the poem than Manet was.
He was more interested in like who was the narrator and the social components of the narrator and the raven, but he didn't want to dissect so much, what does the raven represent? Here we're getting into the world that the raven comes from potentially, and the larger picture beyond just the urban component.
I think Manet was interested more than anything in pulling Poe into his world.
Yeah. He already was trying to make sense, it seems like, of his world, and that his painting was his way to sort of make sense with this new emerging class. Sure. And so he wanted to take the other elements and interpret them, whereas Doré sort of seems to take a different approach, obviously.
Yeah. And of course, notice again the importance of the light and dark in these illustrations. Far more animated.
You can actually see expressions on the people's faces in a different way.
Much more of a kind of supernatural element that's at work here. Here I would guess would be some sort of ghost-like figure, which often appears in I think he did about 25 of these plates for the Raven, just on the Raven.
Wow.
And many of them feature women like this one, who seems to be a kind of disembodied figure who's floating around and is an extension of the mental situation of the poet narrator.
Right, like she's not an actual real person, but like, is she Lenore? Do we know? Maybe unclear. Which is, there's still that mysterious ambiguity, I think, too, which is great. It's not a clear cut sort of, oh, this is what the painting means. There's a lot of different layers, but it also has the clear cut vision that is clearly a different aesthetic than what came in the past.
And if I could call your attention here, presumably here's the go back. Here's the manuscript that he's been reading to try to assuage his pain over the long war. And the Raven far more a diabolical figure than we see in Manet here.
Yes, definitely. And I think then, people can interpret it in different ways, of course, there's not one clear cut answer, but yes, the Raven is definitely more of an evil sort of hell-like figure in these ones.
And it also seems to be far more of a sadistic, torturing figure too. Here he is perched on the bust of Pallas, but behind him is a kind of chandelier that has all of these images of the dead Lenore in it.
Mm-hmm.
So that the narrator has to look at these things. This is the last thing he's going to see of Lenore. These images.
That's right, yeah. And I do want to just be conscious of time too, because I feel like we could talk forever, but I just want to keep us moving a little. There's so much in the book. I feel like we could talk about it forever, but I do want to make sure that we move as much through the eras as we can, so we end up back today.
So let me keep going. This is a Redon, and Redon was very interested in
I love this one.
Inspiration that you can actually go see this. This is in the Chicago Institute of Art.
I've never been, but I need to go to Chicago.
It's a fabulous museum. But this is it's typically called the Eyeball, but it's got a longer title to it too that has something like the eye floats over infinity or something like that. And less involved with a direct reference to Poe, like the Raven or maybe the Telltale Heart, but probably just taking an inspiration out of Poe and creating his own art.
It's, Poe, I could argue, there's the Poe universe at this point, and I think that definitely seems like something that would fit in with the Poe universe. It takes all those uncanny elements.
And they're all French. So that from early 1870s, all the way to the end of the century, you've got all these French illustrators and French writers who are finding inspiration in Poe. And, that's a whole other, I take this.
And then, and they had more of a sort of pessimist, not a pessimist, but, a more practical compared to sort of then we moved to America, right? And then it's the more optimism and faith and, the American dream, and the tone shifts, of course.
Well, I think the French were attracted to Poe for a lot of reasons, but I think the main reason was that they recognized in Poe somebody who was very un-American.
Yeah.
And they were
very
really
European.
Very European, absolutely. And of course, the book talks a lot about that relationship between Poe and the European model. This is another European, but he's not French. And this is early 20th century, 1909. And his name is Martini, Alberto Martini, spelled like you would imagine the martini to be spelled. Again, like Redon, not giving any title to this, just saying based on the work of Edgar Allan Poe. So you could be looking at Madeline Usher. You might be looking at Ligeia here.
Might be Lenore. You don't know. It could be any of the women. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any one of those women in Poe that comes through the door and enters into the reality. And of course, that door being a symbolic door, right? The door of perhaps separating life from death,
right?
But also separating reality from the supernatural.
Yeah. And just, literally also, Madeline Usher being hidden in the house, also the literal, shutting in of women that was happening during this time as well.
Sure.
Yeah, I feel like that's very like Guillermo del Toro and took a lot of inspiration from a lot of these. I can tell.
That should have probably been its own chapter in Poe. There's no question about it.
I know there's so much. It's almost like I wish we had like 5 hours.
Well, this is what I told my publisher. I said, look, there are over 700 illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe.
Right. How are you supposed to choose?
How do you pick the top 30 or 40 of them? It's very difficult and it's very frustrating because this book could have been 3 times the size of what it is.
No, I think it was a really great length too. I mean, just, going back to the reading component, I think it's, we're getting into some more academic discourse here, but I think what's really great about it too is regardless of your familiarity with Poe, you're going to pick it up because you're interested in art, because you're just interested in the relationship between an illustrator and the works of someone who is just a name in American literature, but literature in general. So I think, there is so much that can be learned, even if you think that you're not someone who's interested in illustrations or the visual medium. If you think you're more of like a words person, totally squashes those, that preconceived notion.
Well, Rachel, I make this statement. I think it's bold, but I think it's true at the same time, that Poe was the most important American writer to ever come out of our country.
Oh, I think you have plenty of evidence to back that. And I agree. I mean, it's hard to find somebody who's as influential and has, maintained popularity and cultural relevance, which I know you talk about at the end of the book. And, I didn't even think about really, like, I watched the show Altered Carbon. And of course I recognized that there was that Poe figure, but I didn't think about what that meant for like the larger implications of, oh, wow, Edgar Allan Poe is still so culturally relevant that he's like become this AI character on a Netflix show.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's everything too. It's not just literature that he's
Right.
headed back, but there are over 100 films that have been made of Poe's work.
There's t-shirts, there's online Etsy shop, there's everything. You could write a whole book about that. Just Poe in like the commercialization of Poe and the commodification of him.
And a lot of people have written about that. That's a big part of the Poe mystique, isn't it?
Yes, because that's, he was certainly, that wasn't his intention when he started out. So.
Okay, so this is another martini. Obviously, for anyone who's read The Telltale Heart, they recognize what he's up to here in splitting the face of the old man and emphasizing that eye. Now we get into the Americans, and this is early modernism. This is the early part of the 20th century. A painter by the name of Blumenschein, and this is one of my favorite illustrations of all of them, for the Black Cat.
Yeah, I love that cat.
The way in which we see elements of surrealism at work here in the early part of the 20th century. The sky seems to have a kind of energy going through it. The landscape is tilted at an angle. We've got almost a version of, here's Manet's boulder again, right?
Yeah.
The boulder hat turns into a kind of scream that seems to be good. Wilk does the scream in 1895. And so this is probably 20 years later. So that image of the scream as a voice of terror is present here as well. And so too is the knotted tree, which suggests the kind of inner personality inside of this very astute man who's hanging his cat.
Right. And he also isn't looking, he's looking at the ground. So it's almost like a little bit of shame or discomfort with himself too.
He's become primitivized too. He's this figure of violence and this figure of this figure of alcoholism, really.
Yeah.
As he is in the short story, and the whole world seems to have been tilted, as though he's not on stable ground here. Now, I really think this is a magnificent
this is beautiful
illustration. This is Arthur Becker's The Pit and the Pendulum.
Yes.
Also early 20th century, first decade of the 20th century. I'm trying to think. I think Becker is also American.
I don't think I wrote that one down.
If I could draw your attention here to all these figures that are
the multi-layered too, with the different layers, not only the background and the foreground, but the way that they play with temporal space too is really cool.
Yeah.
And he seems like a much more human figure too than I think some of the other Pit and the Pendulum illustrations that we've seen, like his contrast of being a much more human figure compared to the skeleton, the death in the background, like his humanity is being confronted more than in the other one. Even the one on the cover of the book, he's much more of a monstrous figure.
If we could get a close-up of his face, I think it would illustrate what you're saying there about his humanity, that the look of terror in his eyes as he's watching that scimitar moving across his body. And even here, a little touch that's probably missed by a lot of viewers, you can see where it's actually made contact with his.
Yeah, I didn't even notice that on first glance.
Yeah. So here we are back to the poetry. Again, this is early part of the 20th century. Oh God, I'm drawing a blank on who this is now.
Is this no, I don't know. I didn't write it down either. It's okay. We'll find it. Okay. We can find it after.
But this is an illustration of the bells, and while there is no figure that rings the bells in Poe's poetry, again, it's the image of almost insanity and frenetic.
Right, and this is much more of a monstrous figure, and the not quite human, but also not quite fully a monster, still has the human features, but that look, it's always the abject terror look is really palpable.
And now remember where we are in the early part of the 20th century, where these illustrators are all trying in somehow to take from Poe an element that would have belonged to World War One. And the terror of what was going on in World War One with its mechanized warfare and the cruelty that happened to so many people. So many millions died in that war in 4 years.
Right.
And all of Europe was shocked by it. The whole world was shocked by it.
Yeah, because they had, it was the First World War. No one ever experienced that level of mass casualty throughout the entire world.
Yeah, and especially through it was the first real mechanized war.
Right.
The machine gun, airplanes dropping bombs, mustard gas, barbed wire. All of these things were part of World War.
Yeah, and before it had just been, even the Civil War just feels so primitive compared to that. Isn't it? There was only 50 years between World War I and the Civil War?
Well, let's see. World War One is 1916
and 65. So 60 years. That's not that long. The difference, is vast between muskets and bayonets and very primitive stuff, basically the Revolutionary War, more or less. And then you go to, you're right, machine guns and planes and all this crazy stuff.
That's right.
I love the faces I love how they play with the backgrounds and the way that these the faces and the goth. I think that is such a Poe thing, to have the faces and the different expressions, but also for them to be part of the background, they meld together.
This is, I think, the third stanza of the Bells, where there's a fire that's raging on down here. And I would imagine what the illustrator's trying to do here is to capture the sense of souls that are being burned alive.
The anguish and the agony.
Yeah. Again, I think this is an Irish illustrator.
And so is this what movement is this considered?
Still in modernism.
Still modernism, okay.
Yeah.
The focus on the grotesque and the dark. And also there's, I think there's the difference where Manet was more just trying to show society and show as it was emerging in its everyday realness. And now we're really getting to the dark underbelly, and we're getting to the things that we don't always talk about. And the thing, now we do, but back then, to think about this sort of war, but World War I, you're right, that it brought it up for us. So we had to confront it.
So if we jump ahead to 1935, we find probably the most important of all of Poe's illustrators.
Yeah, and his name is
Arthur Rackham. Arthur Rackham is Irish, UK, And he discovers Poe late in life. Rackham did a lot of fairy tale illustrations. And here is his illustration for The Fall of the House of Usher, where the Usher mansion is turned almost into a prison.
And it's also pretty much the focus of the illustration.
Yeah, yes, as it should be.
Right, because it's literally the title. And it's the main character. But yeah, then you also have the human in the back or the foreground.
These blasted trees almost take on shapes of their own too. And of course, here's the narrator looking up at the house.
Right, again, those sort of the anguished souls. It's these trees are like the tree version of the anguished souls.
Exactly. So Rackham discovers Poe late in his career, but does a series of about 30 illustrations that are published under Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And it's a beautiful book, many of them in color, like this one. And there's, of course,
the cover.
This is another Rackham. This is the pit and the pendulum here. Here's the pit, the figure of the tortured soul from the pit and the pendulum.
But yeah, again, he's much more monstrous or, less human rather than the other illustration that we saw.
But if you look carefully along the margins, you can see Rackham's work as a fairy tale artist. You can see
those bordered edge. You're pointing out things that I didn't even notice on first glance. That's so cool.
Yeah,
I love that.
You can see his work in fairy tales that are at work here.
Probably because I bought the Kindle version, which is significantly cheaper for those who are on a budget. You don't get the same effect, unfortunately. So I think that's probably why I missed out on a few of these things, because they were in black and white. So that's why.
My only regret about the book really is that it wasn't coffee table size.
But then it would have been even more money.
We're going to spend it. This is another Rackham.
This one you can see the fairy tale influence clear in this one.
Yeah, cartoon-like, aren't they?
Right. Yeah, very cartoon. And the exaggerated expressions, but in a way that emphasizes, and I think that's what's important about Rackham, is it emphasizes the humanity more, even though they are like monstrous and cartoonish in their physical aspect, their expressions and you still recognize them as human characters. They're cartoonish, but they're still more rooted in our reality than that more like demonic type figure.
The other thing I'd add to that, Rach, is that we also see a kind of raw psychology that's at work.
Right, because Freud's theory of psychoanalysis was coming into play around the same time, right?
Absolutely. This is 1935. So the way in which we see these characters who are almost paranoid, well, not paranoid, but because they have committed crime, but all these eyes, even the eyes of the painting.
Well, you can see, I like the underneath too, literally playing again with that notion of the underbelly of society and what lies underneath, and we can still see it, even though we want to ignore it. We can't, it's still there.
This is Poe's telltale heart. And of course, this is the body after it's been cut up by the killer. I
love it. Oh my God. But it's also like, it's not, of course it's a body, but again, it's a cartoonish body because it's more of the metaphorical body. If something was actually decaying, he didn't just draw the skeleton. It looks more, artistic.
Here's your cask of Amontillado from Rackham.
I love this one too. Yeah, his Fortunato, they literally look like court jesters. And it plays with that sort of, almost like a puppet show. They look like puppet show characters.
Yeah, my co-writer was really interested in, Jessica Slayton was really interested in writing about this particular image because she was especially attracted to the kind of almost suffocating atmosphere of the nitra coming down. And, he's going to be sealed off clearly here with that skeleton face over there. All of this is going to be sealed tight, but he's going to be alone with this organic fungi that's about,
and that's going to continue to live even when he's dead,
and it will absorb him.
Right, he'll become part of that.
Exactly. Okay, so this is the last one.
Now we're back. Now we're into modern Poe.
This is Lynn Barnes and her version of Edgar Allan Poe's Last Supper.
all the different Poes and his characters. When did this come out? Because she was also, she kept adding to it, right?
She still is. This is an ongoing work. I've seen several versions of it. This happened to be the one that I could find on the internet, of Poe on his deathbed in the hospital in Baltimore, surrounded by his characters. Oop, didn't mean to go there yet. Surrounded by his characters. For example, here's Pym from the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym with his turtle. Let's see, here's Hop Frog down here. Ligeia up here. I think this is the figure from the Inquisitor from what is that? The Pit and the Pendulum.
Yeah, that makes sense. He looks like that.
Here's one of Poe's bartenders bringing him a heart. I know, it's amazing.
And the way that she adds all those little like cards and other objects.
Well, the cards because Poe was a gambler.
Right, and you got, of course, his alcohol and his poison on the table.
Alcoholic, and here's perhaps the Lady of the Sea from Poe's last poem, Annabel Lee.
And I see an owl, but is there a raven in here?
Over here.
Oh yeah, duh. But it's also, the raven is almost like you can't see it on first glance because it's black, because it's so much a part of him that it's almost like you don't even notice it at first.
Well, and also notice the way things are kind of a surreal energy here.
Yeah, it's got like an esoteric vibe to it.
Yeah. Here's the absinthe.
Yep. Is that a pen next to it?
I'm not sure.
What is it?
I'm not sure, but everything seems to be in motion here.
Yeah, just it's constantly in flux, and the lighthouse in the background too with the moon, and so he's by the sea. So
this comes late, Rachel, and unfortunately I wasn't able to put it into the book, but this is one of my students.
Oh my gosh.
Working with illustrating Poe.
Before you even wrote the book?
No, after it was out, I would have made him part of the book, because I think these illustrations are so fabulous.
Wow, these are.
His name is Alex Lumina, and Alex is a great painter, a great artist, as well as a great reader of Poe.
What media is this? Just pencil, or what medium is this?
This is pen and ink.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, as someone who can barely draw a stick figure, I'm always just in awe of
Isn't this great?
It's crazy.
Here's another one of his.
Wow. These again, they're so, you can tell that they're his individual style, but he's pulling from so many of the other elements that we've seen so far. I love it.
Yeah.
So did you do that? Like you had an assignment where some of your students had to do illustrations, or he just did it?
No, he just came up to me after hearing, I gave this lecture to my class. We were studying Edgar Allan Poe, and when we were done with the session dealing with Poe, I gave a version of this lecture to them, and he came up to me and said, I got to show you some stuff I've been working on.
He had already, wow. Like while he, just in class, sort of like doodling it?
No, at home.
Oh, okay. At home.
At home.
Wow.
Now, this is not Alex anymore. I took this from the internet, and I just wanted to show you how Poe keeps cropping up, in all of these images that people made. I'm especially fond of this one because I think it's I think when I went to LACMA and there was like a Guillermo del Toro exhibit, and I think there was like an Edgar Allan Poe wax figure, and I can't remember if that was like part of his collection or not. But again, it's like, yeah, you buy shirts with his face on them, and again, there's Etsy stores, and I think it's, he's become like, yes, he has that sort of like gothic element to him, but he's also, there's like Funko Pops that are Poe now. So he's like a friendly, he's a fun guy too. One of the things you notice once you get to the latter half of the 20th century and into our own time, in terms of illustrating Poe, is that Poe's figure becomes transposed with the characters that are that are part of the story.
Right, because that was not happening for a while, right? It was the artist was separate from the art, and then he became slowly to become a part of it again.
In the last 70 years or so, the more you study the illustrations, the more you realize that the illustrators are linking them to Poe's own face.
Was there one in particular that sort of started that notion, or is there an artist that, sort of slowly happened?
I think it's been a steady accruing.
And I wonder if that's because like enough time had passed for him to have been dead, and anyone who sort of knew him, so that people felt like they had a new agency with him. He almost rose to this like mythological figure where they say heroes get remembered, but legends never die. That's from the movie The Sandlot, great movie. And I always, I think of that in terms of these types of people, though, because there's plenty of authors and plenty of writers we remember, but Poe is never literally. Maybe it's some sort of cosmic agency, but he's never dying. He just keeps being reborn in different formats. And it's, more than just his work now, but literally his body and his body of work, but his body and his face are everywhere.
Sure. By the second half of the 20th century and into our own time, Poe's face has become famous.
It's just like it's so recognizable. It's more than just, I know his work or I know the name. It's like you might not even know his work, or you might just know the name, but you'll see his face and you'll be like, there's that writer guy, or didn't he write something about a raven?
And even when you turn to the cartoons, the Gay and Wilson cartoons, the Simpsons, I'm trying to think of the other one, South Park, all of them have episodes that deal with Poe. And it's Poe in various situations, but it's always Poe.
Right.
He's the character.
And it's distinguishably Poe, too. I think sometimes people like to mix and match with, there's a few authors who fit this, so it's sort of an amalgamation of their styles, but there's really no one like him. He is one of a kind.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what happens is his fame has reached the point of where his face is as famous as the work itself.
Yeah. Probably. I hate to say it, but I don't want to have that little faith in society, but it may be even more famous because think about how many less people are reading, and especially, his works in general, I don't think get as much of like the adaptation treatment as Shakespeare. Like, his works are maybe not as read as often, but they come out with like 10 Things I Hate About You and She's the Man. And that's what's interesting about Poe is there's been a lot of films that are more indirectly adapted by his work, but I don't think there's as many, but that's a good thing to explore too. I don't know if I have the answer, but why are his works maybe not as adapted as literally? And maybe that's because they're so good that there's really not a lot you can do. There's so much to unpack in the existing stories that there's not a lot you can do with them. And maybe they don't need to be adapted, but rather the themes. I know I've read even like, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was like a young adult novel I know I read 5 or 6 years ago that took the idea of the House of Usher and the brother and the sister, and it literally was like a modern day retelling.
Yeah, well, even something like The Shining.
Right.
The Shining brings us back to Usher again, and Mask of the Red Death is even quoted in the foreword.
What was that really bad one that you had us? The Cask of Amontillado, the Christian Slater, wasn't he in that or something?
Oh, sure, yeah.
They're not all winners.
Dolan's Cadillac.
Yeah, that one was not. That's literally, and it's kind of funny too, because Stephen King, of course, the other great horror guy, for him to take Poe and do an adaptation, and maybe it was just the film. I haven't read the book or the story that it's based on, but we talked about the film as not being one of the best adaptations.
No, it's not, but it's got an interesting premise, doesn't it? This idea
that's true.
And given this context of this postmodern superhighway that's being
right,
built,
how do we reestablish that for modern society? We do that.
Yeah. Instead of putting them into your family crypt, you put them into
which I kind of wish that's what I'm like, but I feel like that could still kind of happen today. Plenty of people bury people in their houses or underground. That's why I was like, it was trying to be too political. I think Poe's are like the domestic horror is really what is so scary about them. And then to try to expand it to have this other maybe that's for me why it didn't work. I'm like, I would have rather someone be buried in someone's house. And they're so, that's why Manet was probably drawn to them, the psychological and the behavioral components of the people that he explores in his stories. And the real horrors are not the monsters tapping at your door, but the person inside your door.
Yeah. And of course, the illustrators that do the best work on Poe capture that.
Exactly.
Like Blumenschein's painting of the Black Cat.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and I'm so glad I saw them in color, because that is the one downside of the Kindle version is that I should have looked them up in color after. Well, this has been, we just went through almost 200 years of art in like an hour. Do you have any parting thoughts for the audience? Of course, if any of this intrigued you all, you definitely need to check out the book. If the physical copy is too much, I think the Kindle copy is around $40, which is not too bad for an academic text.
And I think the thing is that you really need to sit down with the book.
Yeah.
And spend some time with it, because it does deal with some pretty complex connections.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it's a lot to unpack, even though it's presented very straightforwardly. There's just so much. I mean, there's so many layers. Again, Poe's work itself has so many layers. So how could it not to explore it? And then the analysis that you all have done, I don't think there's been much talk. Is there any other real academic discourse about the illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe, but in a more contemplative, tracing the history?
Not this comprehensive.
That's what I meant. Like, of course, there's been work done on individual ones, but has there been any? Because you all are, you're ultimately taking the past and you're taking stuff that has already happened and you're making connections to contemporary society, and you're bringing up new points that have not been explored. So yes, the comprehensive sort of looking at it from conception to today. Is this the first book of its kind?
It is. But my only regret, that said, is that it should be 5 times bigger than it is.
Well, maybe this is the opening, and then you can cut each section into its own. This is the starter, and then
it needs to have, like, for example, we need to have a chapter on Asian responses to Poe. We need to have a chapter on
South America. Did they
South American?
Yeah. So let's have let's do the Great Illustrators of Edgar Allan Poe Part 2.
Part 2.
If only, once I win the lottery, I'll fund your publishing.
This has been 5 years in the making, and we're only half done.
Right. That's, you barely scratched this. I mean, scratch the surface, but there's a lot more and so it took you 5 years to write this?
Yeah.
With Jessica? Wow. Yeah. I mean, you can tell it's clearly it's a labor of love, and you can tell that a lot of thought and research went into it.
But that's my only regret, really, Rach, is that this probably could have taken another 5 years to have included the South Americans and the Asians.
Well, you can always release a companion. You can always release a second edition. So.
I don't know. I'm pretty tired.
I was going to say, you're probably done at this point.
I'm probably done at this point.
On to the next.
Only so much time left.
Right. Well, this has been wonderful as always. I learned so much. I'm sure our audience did as well. And we'll have to have you on again next time. You have a new Stephen King book coming out too soon?
Just came out, Rach, right here.
I got to read that one. Violence in the Films of Stephen King. Oh, is that hardcover?
This is the hardcover.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll check that one out as well. I'll have to check it out, and maybe we'll have you back sooner than a year and then you have a book of poetry coming out soon too.
Yeah. That's going to come out late fall.
Okay, so maybe once you have that, we'll have you back on for a Stephen King poetry
Let's
one.
Do something different. Let me do some of my poems.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. And I've recently been exploring contemporary poetry, so I'd love to talk a little. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. All right. Well,
and this book, the poetry book, will be affordable. That'll only
yeah, that's the beauty of poetry, is usually their books are very
$10 or $12.
Wonderful. Well, it has been amazing. Until we'll link the book below. You can buy it on Amazon. And until next time, everyone, stay reading.
Thanks, Rach. Good to have you here.